welcome back to We Be Kids again. After a really warm weekend where I had my t-shirt on in the garden, I've pulled my scarf out today because there's a real nip in the air. But there are many signs of spring around. We've seen a peacock butterfly and a buff-tailed bumblebee, and just a moment ago whilst I was sat here, I spotted a tree creeper that was trying to find a spot in amongst the dead wood to make its nest. And next week as well is the spring equinox. And the spring equinox is a time when the amount of day and the amount of night is exactly the same. 12 hours day, 12 hours night. And from that point on, the days begin to get longer and the nights begin to get shorter. So this story that I'm going to tell you today is a story that I wrote and was inspired by the spring equinox. And this story is called The Return of the Light. Now this story happened way before the ancient moons, a long time before anybody, any of you have ever known, were born. It was at a time when the whole of the world was covered in thick, lush, green forests. And many creatures lived in the thick, green forests. But there were two creatures who had particular significance in the woods at this time. One of them was a shiny black mole that lived in tunnels underground. And the other was a beautiful buzzard that lived in the tops of the tallest trees. And the reason why these creatures were important is because the mole had a very significant role to play in the world. You see, the mole would tunnel underground all over the forest, and each night it would raise itself up to the surface and it would pull all of the light in from the sky and put it in the ground. And then it would pour the darkness out, filling every corner of the forest and every inch of the sky. And the buzzard's role was equally important. You see, as the mole slept, the buzzard would wake and it would fly through the forest and fly through the sky, chasing out all of the darkness and bringing in the light of the next day. Now the buzzard and the mole and all the creatures of the forest lived quite happily together. And they had all agreed that in the cycle of the sun, the mole and the buzzard would have the equal amount of daytime and the equal amount of nighttime. But the mole had begun to spend more and more time underground. It had begun to spend less and less time with the other creatures of the forest. And in this solitude deep in the earth, began to get hungry for power. Deep in its heart, it wanted more and more darkness. And it was forever scheming and plotting a way that it could take over the whole forest with its darkness and get rid of the light forever. And then one night, after he had pulled the light in and spread the darkness, the mole went seeking and searching for some items. It gathered the skull of a rat, 3 snake skins from the adder. It gathered 5 long thorns from the blackthorn tree and 2 rocks. And it brought them all to a huge giant boulder that was in the forest. And with the rocks it began to bash all of the items together until it made them into a fine dust. It then took some sap from the yew tree and it mixed it in with the dust until it had a thick paste. It then smeared the paste all over the gigantic boulder and covered it with sticks. And then the mole sat and waited. It waited for the moon to get high in the sky, and when the moon got to its highest point, its light shone down on the rocks, and with a huge explosion, the granite boulder exploded. And there, left in its place on the ground, was a stone egg. You see, the mole's plan was to take this stone egg, and while the buzzard was out spreading light in the world, it would place the stone egg into the buzzard's nest. So when the buzzard returned, like any good mother, it would sit on the nest, warm the egg and wait for it to hatch. But the mole knew that a stone egg would never hatch. And while the buzzard was sat for eternity on its nest, the mole could take over the forest and fill it with darkness. So the mole called for the help of the raven, and the raven waited till the buzzard was out, and it carried the stone egg and placed it gently in the buzzard's nest. And when the buzzard returned, it saw this egg in its nest, and it nestled down, and it began to warm the egg, waiting for it to hatch. And while the buzzard was busy doing this, the mole took its chance. It spread through the forest, it tunnelled deeper than ever, it removed as much light as possible, and then it filled every corner, every inch of the forest with pitch black darkness. And it stayed like that for a long time, until some of the creatures of the forest could see what was happening. The woodpecker and the squirrel and the rabbit, and they went to the nest of the buzzard, and they climbed up the tree and they said, "Buzzard, you must bring back the light. Without the light, the whole forest will die." But the buzzard refused. The buzzard said, "I will sit here on my egg until it hatches, and only then will I bring back the light." And the animals waited and waited, but time seemed to go on forever and ever. The buzzard's egg should have hatched by now. But at the top of the tree, the raven was watching. Now, the raven is a very cunning bird, but also a very, very clever bird. And the raven knew that without light, the forest would die. So the raven called for the woodpecker, and the raven told the woodpecker about the stone egg. And the woodpecker flew to the buzzard's nest and told the news to the buzzard. And when the buzzard heard that its egg was actually made of stone, its heart filled with anger and fury. It lifted up from its nest and it flapped its wings with such ferocity that it caused a tornado. And the tornado blew and the nest scattered far and wide, and everything in the nest was lost. And the buzzard took to the sky and was gone. The animals of the forest went back to the raven. They said, "You must help us. We need to know where the buzzard has gone." And the raven agreed and went off on a mission, and it looked far and wide across the whole forest for what seemed like an eternity. And when it had almost finished, out right at the edge of the forest, sat on the edge of the world, looking over into the universe, was the buzzard. And the raven flew back and told the woodpecker and the squirrel and the rabbit where the buzzard was. But it was so far that they couldn't get there alone. They asked the raven for help, but the raven declined. He said, "I have helped all that I can." So they asked the bear, and the bear said, "I am too clumsy to go all the way to the edge of the earth." Just when they'd run out of ideas who to ask, fireflies came flitting through the forest. They said, "The fireflies can help us. Can you lead the way to the buzzard?" The fireflies agreed. They said, "Yes, of course we can." So they went to hold the fireflies, but as they touched the fireflies, their light went out. So they said, "We need to put the fireflies into something." And all around them, the world was covered in ice and frost. And the rabbit said, let's make a lantern out of ice. And we can put the fireflies in there, and when we walk, the ice will illuminate the forest and guide us. So they went down to the river and they made ice lanterns using rocks. And they got the fireflies and they put the fireflies in and they set off walking. But after they had been walking for a couple of hours, the heat from the fireflies melted the ice lantern. And they returned with sadness in their hearts. But again, the raven had been watching this, and the raven swooped down, and the raven said to the animals of the woods, do you not know the legend of the buzzard's egg? The raven said, any ice lantern that is made with rocks will always melt, but an ice lantern made with a buzzard egg will stay in form forever and last for eternity. And the animals said, we don't have a buzzard's egg. But then the woodpecker said, why don't we go back and try and find the stone egg? Maybe, because it had the intention to be a buzzard's egg, maybe that will work. So they went back to the site of the buzzard's nest, and they searched far and wide everywhere looking for the egg. And one of the animals, a small wood mouse, cried out, come see, come see, come see. And all the animals flew and scurried over to where the wood mouse was. And the wood mouse was stood on a piece of broken wood, looking down with amazement in its eyes. And all the other animals looked, and they were amazed too, because there sat on the woodland floor was not just one buzzard egg, but two. They realised at that moment that the buzzard must have had its own egg as well as the stone egg. That is why she was so angry. They picked up both of the eggs, but they couldn't tell the difference. They said the only way to tell the difference is to make an ice lantern using both eggs. And the one that lasts forever will have the egg of the buzzard. So they took them down to the river and they made 2 ice lanterns, and they put fireflies in each one, and they set off on their journey. And as expected, after only a couple of hours, one of the lanterns melted. And they knew which egg was stone and which egg was real. With the lantern made from the real egg, they continued on their journey through the forest for what seemed like an eternity, led by the fireflies. And they knew when they had arrived at the buzzard, they could smell the salty tears from the buzzard's eye, and they could hear a soft whimpering and a soft crying from the buzzard's heart. And they went on, and the rabbit called out to the buzzard, and the buzzard heard them and flew up high into the sky and began to circle, as we see buzzards do today. And as it circled and circled, it looked down, and with its great eyesight, it saw the ice lantern. And immediately it knew that only an ice lantern that would last forever would have made it all the way to the edge of the earth. And in that moment it knew that the other animals had its egg. It swooped down into the forest. The squirrel held the egg up, and the buzzard came down and grabbed it with its talons and flew off. And as it flew high into the sky, and with the moonlight behind it, it opened its wings and began to flap. And as the light of the moonlight shone through the buzzard's bright underwings, 2 shots of light went out across the whole of the earth and split the darkness in 2. And as they did, the darkness sank into the earth and the light returned. And the mother buzzard, she flew back and she made a nest, and she placed that egg into the nest, and she hatched that egg. And when the baby buzzard was born, she called it Maideen, which is the Gaelic word for morning. And every morning when the light comes into the world, we think about the brave and the courageous Mother Buzzard. So I hope you enjoyed that story. It's one for this time of year when we think about the coming and the going of the light. Spring is a really exciting time to go out and to watch the animals, especially the buzzard. We've been watching the buzzard circling above us recently, and when the sunlight gets behind it, the beautiful bright light that comes under his feathers is really, really amazing to see. So go out and see if you can find some buzzards this week. Also, as the equinox comes, maybe consider going out and watching the sunrise or watching the sunset on this special day. So I hope you enjoyed that story. We'll see you again sometime soon. Thanks for stopping by at Weeby Kids. Bye.